What's up guys, Lisa He here of Borderlands Bakery, and today I'm going to talk about the common struggles when people are making cutout cookie dough. Before we get into the actual problems, I'm going to put out there that having a recipe with the proper ratios and baking it with the proper technique and using an oven thermometer is going to solve 90% of the problems that you're experiencing with your cookie dough. If you don't have a recipe that's reliable, we have some tried and true recipes in our shop. And I also link you to some recipes that I really like that are also really consistent. First thing when it comes to making cookie dough that's consistent and that holds its shape is really making sure you are consistent with your recipe. When I started baking 15 years ago at this point, and I made my first cutout cookie about 13 years ago, I was kind of just winging it and using volumetric measurements, which is common in American baking and only American baking, but I was inconsistent with how much product I was actually using because volume measures very differently from weight. 1 cup of flour, depending on how much it's actually settled and packed in or didn't pack in, could vary up to 20%. And that's gonna have a huge impact on the final result of your bakes. So I highly recommend you get a food scale and learn how to use it. It is super simple, but it's going to get you very consistent with your recipes. This way, you can also scale your recipes up or down with a lot of ease. I also highly recommend you get an oven thermometer. Most of our home ovens and even commercial ovens aren't actually 100% true to temperature. Aside from the natural hot spots that are in every single oven, there's also discrepancies in the actual temperature versus what the dial says. My old oven used to vary up to 50 degrees, and that can make or bake your cookies.
50?
Yeah, 50. Today, I have a really good oven. I have a GE Cafe Line oven. It's absolutely incredible, but when I need it to be at 300 degrees, I have to set it at 305. When I need it to be 450, I set it at 425. The way you're going to know that is by using an oven thermometer. That's going to save your cookies from either, underbaking, overbaking, or spreading. One of the most common issues people come to me about is their cookie is not keeping shape during the bake. This could show up in the form of your cookie spreading and losing its shape, or even warping and coming out in the shape that you did not expect. Let's focus on spreading first. Spreading can be a cause of several different factors. The easiest one for me to rule out first is making sure you're baking at an appropriate temperature. If your temperature is too low, all that butter is gonna melt, causing some ooze before the shape of your cookie actually settles. If the temperature is too high, you're gonna cook the cookie and potentially burn it on the outside, and the insides are still gonna be raw. Both of those things you can see, right? So if your cookies spread and they don't keep their shape, maybe it's a temperature thing, maybe it's a ratio thing. And it's obvious when your temperature is too high because they will start browning before they actually cook through. People always ask me, what is the effect of leavening, like baking soda and baking powder, on the spread of your cookies? This is an oversimplification, but for the most part, remember it like this. Baking soda promotes more spread. It also impacts texture and taste a little bit. And baking powder impacts rise and the crumb structure of your cookies. I actually use baking powder in some of my recipes to help it rise a little bit. It doesn't impact the spread. So now that you've got your oven thermometer and you know your temperature is right, you know which leavening to use or not to use, the other thing is making sure that you have a good ratio for your recipe. I talked about giving you some examples of recipes that worked really well for me and ones that worked well for other people. You also have to figure out if that works for you, right? And the only way you can do this is by testing out a bunch of different recipes. There's really no magic ratio, because ratios also impact taste and texture. If you think your recipe is good or you really like it, do that, bake it, and look at your temperature, look at your leavening, and if your cookies are still spreading, it could be your butter temperature that's the culprit. If you are creaming your butter and sugar together at the first stage of making that dough and your butter is pretty melty, you're gonna end up potentially with a cookie that spreads a bit more. I like to use butter that's room temperature. Some people use cold butter, but what does room temperature actually mean? I think you'll find that it's a little colder than what we expect it to be. So butter straight out of the fridge, you put your finger in it, it's gonna leave a little bit of an oily mark and maybe maybe get your fingerprint on it, but it's not gonna change shape. Butter at room temperature is gonna have some give, but when you remove your finger from it, it's gonna look a little oily and you're gonna leave an imprint, but it doesn't look melty. A lot of times I see people leave their butter out for like, I don't know, 5-6 hours. They've set their AC to like 78 degrees, or it's the summer or spring, and their butter has started to lose shape. That is too warm. So you kind of want to find a middle ground. I've had a lot of people use cold butter with success, as long as you're creaming it appropriately and getting rid of all the little like extra pockets of butter. We're looking for a smooth dough, not a puff pastry dough with a lot of air pockets. So that's something that you should be aware of as you're baking your dough. Having the right ratios, having a good butter temperature, and baking at the right temperature is also going to give you those beautiful clean edges that a lot of people go after when they want to make cutout cookies. The other issue that I hear people struggle with is getting straight lines for their geometric cookies. A lot of this goes back to your base dough again, and making sure that recipe is robust and you can get clean cuts and that it bakes cleanly. But in case you don't get straight edges, or you like a cookie recipe that's just softer, that's fine too. The moment it comes out of the oven, this applies to circular cookies as well. You can put your cookie cutter on the perimeter of the cookie and kind of maneuver it, or use straight edges like spatulas or pastry scrapers or stencil scrapers to kind of push the edges together while it's still warm when the cookies come out of the oven. So immediately after the bake, while they're soft, you still have some time to maneuver the edges of your cookie for that perfect straight edge or circle. If you've waited too long and your cookies have cooled, you can use a microplane to shave down the sides of your cookies to help it be more straight. You can also do this for pretty much any shape, using a microplane to go around the perimeter to shape it to whatever you desire. Of course, this is extra work, and it takes off that outer layer of your cookies, exposing a little bit more of the insides, potentially increasing the probability of your cookie drying out a little bit faster because you're taking that outer layer off. So just keep that in mind if you're going to use the microplane route. I also hear people struggling with a domed or puffy center in their cookies. Most of our recipes use eggs, and eggs tend to help things rise or puff, as does baking powder. So if your recipe contains those two things, it's possible that there's just a little bit too much of them. But also, if you find your tops a little bit domed, you can use a fondant smoother to kind of iron the tops of your cookies and to push them down and flatten them a little bit. Now, it's also possible that if it's not your actual recipe itself and you don't feel like flattening them after the bake, you are incorporating too much air into your batter when you're creaming your butter and sugar together. Some recipes call for that creaming process to be like 5 minutes. Some recipe just says cream until well combined. You can really beat the crap out of your butter until it becomes buttercream. So if you are creating a lot of volume in that butter sugar creaming process, it might create puffier cookies. So take that into consideration when you're making your dough. I also hear that some people get bubbles on the surface of their dough, and that's mostly because when you're using or re-rolling the scraps of your dough, you're kind of layering bits and pieces together and incorporating some sneaky air bubbles into those layers, causing those air bubbles to bake into your cookie. I'm gonna be honest here, it's really not a big deal. Post-bake, just kind of push them down with a tool or your finger and they will flatten out right away. And if you want to reduce that happening when you're re-rolling your scraps, it's about being careful in combining your scraps in a way that you're not like accidentally leaving air bubbles between those scraps. When it comes to misshapen dough, it's usually a result of overworked dough or your recipe being off and it just spreading and becoming a shape you don't recognize. But usually, you'll know which one it is because overworked dough also has a tendency to shrink a little bit after the bake. You'll notice that the freshest dough that's only been rolled once, cut out in the same shape, if you put them side by side, the fresher, unworked dough is gonna have that perfect, pristine shape, and the dough that's been worked like 3 or 4 times is gonna look a little bit off and probably shrink a little bit. And that has a lot to do with all the gluten and the chemistry behind working the dough. I recommend working and re-rolling your dough as little times as you possibly can. I always work with several batches of dough at once. I roll it out, I cut out my shapes, I bake them, I take that excess scrap dough, I roll it out again, maybe 2 more times to cut from that and bake from that before I start to notice my shapes are getting a little wonky. So I save that bit of extra dough and I incorporate it into a bit of fresh dough. That way, you don't really notice the difference between how much you've re-rolled your dough. Always keep your scraps, always incorporate them into a fresh batch of dough. Sometimes if you have overworked your dough, you're also going to notice some cracks in your dough. If it's kind of like this volcano eruption, it's most likely a result of actually just over baking and all the excess air is trying to escape from the cookie itself. But if they're just flat cracks, it's usually a result of dried out dough or overworked dough. Hopefully that gave you a lot of things to think about when it comes to troubleshooting your dough. If you have any specific questions, it's really helpful to get some background before we troubleshoot it, because it's really important to know what recipe you're working with, what your technique is, what your bake is like before definitively giving you a response. That's it. If you have any questions or anything to add, I welcome that discussion in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more of these videos in the future. See you next time.